February 6, 1945, 03:47 hours. The forest exploded. Not from Allied artillery, not from an airstrike. From German guns that had been sitting there hidden, waiting positioned in the exact location one man had warned about 16 hours earlier. The first American soldier to die that morning never even heard the shot. He was 19 years old. He was from Indiana. He had a mother who was probably baking bread right now, 6,000 miles away, with no idea her son had just become a casualty of someone else's pride. In the next 20 minutes, dozens of men were cut down on frozen ground. Vehicles burned. A platoon was nearly erased from the map. And at the center of the disaster was a fact so ugly that the officers on the scene could barely speak it aloud. Someone had seen this coming. Someone had walked into a briefing tent, looked his commanding officer in the eye and said, "Something is wrong out there." And that commanding officer had laughed. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next video. Join us as we keep uncovering the hidden stories, extraordinary moments, and forgotten heroes that shape the world we live in today. His name was Private Daniel Mercer. He was 22 years old. He was a farmer from Iowa. He had no medals, no rank, no academy education, and no political connections inside the United States Army. What he had was something that could not be taught in any officer training school. He knew how to listen to silence. And on the night of February 5, 1945, that silence was telling him something that would have saved dozens of American lives if anyone had believed a private was worth listening to. By the time General George S. Patton finished reading the after-action report, one question was burning through 3rd Army headquarters like a flare in the dark. How does a private see what a colonel refuses to? What happened next would change the way every officer in that room thought about rank truth and the price of arrogance. And the man who made it happen was not a general, not a strategist, not a decorated hero. He was a farm boy who had spent his whole life learning to hear what the woods were trying to say. By the winter of 1944 into 1945, the Western Front was in a state of violent uncertainty. The Allied advance had been grinding forward since the breakout from Normandy the previous summer, and by late autumn, American forces had pushed deep into Belgium and were pressing toward the German border itself. On paper, the war looked like it was ending. German units were surrendering in large numbers. Fuel shortages were crippling enemy mobility. Hitler's armies were being compressed from both east and west simultaneously. But the paper was lying. The Battle of the Bulge had just finished reminding every Allied commander what German desperation actually looked like in practice. In December 1944, an attack that military planners had declared impossible had torn through the Ardennes and nearly shattered the American line. Over 19,000 American soldiers were killed. More than 47,500 were wounded. The shock of that offensive had barely faded when units were already being pushed forward again, ordered to maintain the pressure. Keep moving. Do not let the enemy breathe. Inside that pressure lived a specific and deadly problem. Intelligence was struggling to keep up with reality. Aerial reconnaissance gave commanders a picture of the battlefield, but it was a picture taken hours or days ago, not now. Radio intercepts could confirm enemy movement, but only if the Germans were transmitting, and experienced German commanders had learned to maintain radio silence before major operations. The gaps between confirmed intelligence and ground truth were sometimes enormous. And in those gaps, men died. The area near the German border in early February 1945 was exactly this kind of gap. American units were preparing for a series of advances designed to push through remaining resistance and bring the war to its final phase. The forests along the advance routes were dense, snow-covered, and difficult to observe from the air. German units had spent months learning to use those same forests to conceal equipment and manpower. The Americans knew this in principle. What they lacked was specific, timely human-level intelligence about exactly where the enemy was hiding and in what strength. That was the vulnerability, the gap between what the map said and what the frozen ground actually contained. Into that gap walked Daniel Mercer, a private from Iowa, with no way to prove what he knew and no rank to make anyone believe him. Mercer had grown up outside Des Moines in the kind of rural quiet that people raised in cities never fully understand. His father hunted. His grandfather hunted. From the time Mercer was old enough to walk through timber without tripping over his own feet, the two older men had taken him into the woods before sunrise and taught him to do something that most human beings have lost the ability to do entirely. They taught him to stop talking and actually hear what was around him. This sounds simple. It is not. The forest is a system of constant information, and most of that information is invisible to anyone who has not been trained to interpret it. Birdsong is not background noise. It is communication. Specific calls mean specific things. The sudden silence of a crow means something has moved through the area that the crow does not trust. The scatter of squirrels from a particular section of canopy means something large has passed beneath them recently. The absence of deer at a known water source in early morning means something has disturbed their patterns within the last several hours. Mercer's grandfather used to tell him that the woods always tell the truth. Men just get too loud to hear it. By the time Mercer was drafted and shipped to Europe, that education had become instinct. He was not a trained intelligence officer. He was not a specialist in enemy tactics. He was a rifleman, a private the lowest rank in the American military structure. But he carried into combat a perceptual skill set that most officers sitting above him did not possess. He knew how to read absence. He knew how to hear what was missing. In Europe, he discovered that battlefields worked the same way forests did. Danger did not announce itself. It revealed itself through what it removed. An empty road in a village that should have had morning traffic. A farmhouse with no smoke from the chimney at dawn in February when anyone actually living there would have lit a fire hours ago. A dog that had been barking every night for a week now suddenly silent. These were not random observations. These were signals from a system that was being disturbed by something the system itself was trying to avoid. Most soldiers scanned the landscape for what was there. Mercer scanned it for what should have been there, but was not. That difference had kept him alive through months of fighting. It had also made him difficult to understand for officers who were trained to trust verified reports over intuition. But on the night of February 5th, what Mercer was sensing was not vague. It was specific. And it was screaming. He had been standing watch at the edge of the forest that would mark the beginning of the next morning's advance when the silence hit him like a physical thing. No birds. In a European forest in winter, there were always birds. Crows, sparrows, moving through the canopy, small things sheltering in the undergrowth. Not tonight. The forest ahead was absolutely still. Not peaceful still. Wrong still. He moved his attention to the road near the tree line. Fresh track marks in the snow partially covered by new snowfall, which meant they had been made in the last several hours, after the most recent snowfall, but before this one. The width and depth of the tracks eliminated farm wagons and light vehicles. Something heavy had come through, and whoever drove it had stayed as close to the cover of the trees as the road allowed, which was the behavior of someone who did not want to be seen from above. Then he noticed the houses beyond the ridge, several chimneys with no smoke. In February. Either those families had evacuated or they had been moved. And in his experience, civilians only vanished that completely and that quickly when someone with weapons had told them to leave. Finally, there were the sounds from the night before, barely audible but unmistakable to someone who had learned to listen. Engines deep in the forest running for brief intervals and then going silent. Not a single vehicle. Multiple vehicles being repositioned carefully without lights in the dark. The sound of an armored force being placed into concealed firing positions. He reported all of it in the briefing tent. The tracks, the empty houses, the silence, the engines. He laid it out plainly because he did not know any other way to say it. He had no photographs. He had no captured documents. He had no radio intercept. He had observation pattern recognition and 22 years of knowing what a forest sounded like when something was wrong inside it. Colonel Raymond Whitaker listened with the patience of a man who had already decided the answer before the question finished. He asked Mercer whether he had seen enemy troops directly. No, sir. Whether any patrol had confirmed armor. No, sir. Whether aerial reconnaissance showed movement. No, sir. And that was enough. The colonel had heard this kind of report before, frightened young soldiers translating their own anxiety into imaginary threats, hiding behind every dark tree line. He had learned over years of command to filter that fear away quickly. What Whitaker failed to account for was the possibility that this particular young soldier was not afraid, that he was not projecting, that his silence was not anxiety, but information, and that the skills required to gather that information were skills Whitaker did not have and therefore could not evaluate. When Mercer made one final attempt, telling the colonel simply that the forest was too quiet, Whitaker ended the conversation with a sentence that would follow him for the rest of his life. Private forests do not write intelligence reports. A few officers laughed. Mercer said nothing. He had delivered the warning. It had been heard weighed against the confidence of a decorated colonel and discarded. He returned to his position in the dark and waited for the morning to prove which one of them had been reading the situation correctly. The forest answered at dawn exactly where Mercer had said it would. The opening barrage was precisely targeted, not a random sweep, not area suppression, but direct fire on positions and routes that the German force had clearly observed in advance. The lead American elements were hit while still moving into formation. Mortars fell into positions marked safe on maps that were now 12 hours out of date. Machine gun fire raked the frozen ground from angles that made withdrawal as dangerous as advancing. The entire advance locked up inside a killing zone that one man had already named the night before and been laughed at for naming. By mid-morning, the operation had collapsed. Units that had pushed forward were isolated. Vehicles were destroyed or stuck on icy ground under fire. Wounded men lay in the open while others tried to reach them. A company commander was killed near the road. A platoon that had been ordered to reach its first objective before 0600 never made it at all. The reports began arriving in pieces, the way disaster always arrives, in fragments of radio static and urgent runner messages, and medics demanding more supplies than anyone had allocated for what was supposed to be a manageable advance. A broken sentence about a destroyed vehicle. A captain's voice asking why no one had warned them. The count of dead and wounded climbing through numbers that nobody wanted to say out loud. By noon, the officers who had laughed in the briefing tent were no longer laughing. Colonel Whitaker stood over the casualty summaries with the expression of a man who has just understood something that cannot be unfunderstood. Because buried inside those reports attached beneath the main casualty summary was a small document, brief, unpolished, written without officer language. A warning filed at 2100 hours on February 5, 1945, signed by Private Daniel Mercer. Recommending delay. Citing unusual silence, missing civilians, heavy track marks, and the sound of engines being repositioned in the dark. Every specific detail had been correct. Every observation had been confirmed by what the forest did at dawn. And it had been dismissed by a colonel who believed his experience outranked a private's eyes. By late afternoon, the report was moving up through the chain of command. By nightfall, it was on a desk at 3rd Army headquarters, in a room where a general with stars on his collar and a reputation built on reading the truth faster than his enemies was about to open it and ask 2 questions that would make every officer in the American 3rd Army think differently about who was worth listening to. The first question was, who wrote this warning? The second question was going to be far more dangerous for the man who had refused to hear it. In Part 2, we will be inside that room with George S. Patton. We will watch a colonel with campaign ribbons across his chest stand before a general who is holding a casualty list in one hand and a private's warning in the other. And we will see what happens when the most demanding combat commander in the American military decides that arrogance has a price and that price is going to be paid in full. The forest had spoken. Daniel Mercer had heard it. And 37 American soldiers paid with their lives because one colonel refused to listen to a private who grew up talking to trees. That is where Part 1 left us. A farm boy from Iowa filed a warning at 2100 hours on February 5, 1945. He cited silence, missing civilians, heavy track marks, engine sounds in the dark. Every detail was correct. Every observation was confirmed by German guns at dawn. And the report was now sitting on a desk at 3rd Army headquarters, inside a room where George S. Patton was about to ask a question that Colonel Raymond Whitaker would spend the rest of his life trying to answer. Here is what most history books do not tell you. In the 48 hours following that ambush, 3 separate officers attempted to bury Mercer's warning inside the general administrative paperwork of the after-action report. 3 men, all outranking Mercer by considerable distance, understood immediately what that document represented. Not a record of failure. An accusation. And they did not want it reaching Patton's desk with the private's name still attached to it. They failed. The report reached Patton anyway. And what happened next would become one of the most direct and unforgiving acts of command accountability in the entire European theater. Patton read slowly. His staff knew better than to speak when he read. The room at 3rd Army headquarters that evening held perhaps a dozen officers, all of them watching the general's face for some signal about what was coming. Rain moved against the windows. A radio operator sat in the corner pretending to monitor frequencies. Nobody was fooled. The general set down the casualty summary. He picked up the attached warning. He read it once. Then he read it again. Then he looked up. Who wrote this? A captain near the wall answered without hesitation, because hesitation in that room cost more than the truth. Private Daniel Mercer, sir. Rifleman, 22nd years old. Patton did not respond immediately. He looked back at the paper. And who dismissed it? The silence that followed lasted approximately 4 seconds. In a room full of career officers, 4 seconds of silence is a geological event. Finally, an aide answered. Colonel Raymond Whitaker, sir. Patton placed the warning on top of the casualty list. Not beneath it. On top of it. Cause above consequence. Then he gave one instruction. Bring them both here, tomorrow morning. Every officer connected to this operation in the same room. The meeting the next morning was not a private affair. That was the first signal. Patton did not summon Whitaker alone for a quiet reprimand behind a closed door. He ordered every officer whose name had touched the failed advance to be present. Staff officers, company commanders, intelligence personnel, communications officers. Anyone who had stood in that briefing tent or processed paperwork related to the operation stood now beneath the overhead lights of 3rd Army headquarters waiting. Colonel Raymond Whitaker arrived in a pressed uniform. His boots were clean. His campaign ribbons were straight. He was 48 years old, and he had survived North Africa and Sicily, and 2 years of German counterattacks, and he carried himself with the posture of a man who believed his record would speak for him. Private Daniel Mercer arrived still wearing the mud of the front line on his boots. He stood near the rear wall because that was where men of his rank instinctively positioned themselves in rooms like this one. Patton entered without ceremony. He placed 2 documents on the table in front of him. He did not sit down. This was filed before the attack. He held up Mercer's warning. It mentioned missing civilians, silence in the forest, heavy track marks in fresh snow, possible concealed enemy preparation. It recommended delay pending further scouting. He set it down. This arrived after the attack. He placed the casualty summary beside it. He did not read the numbers aloud. Then he looked directly at Whitaker. Colonel, you had this warning in your hands at 2100 hours on the 5th. The attack began at 0347 on the 6th. That is 6 hours and 47 minutes, during which this information existed and was not acted upon. Whitaker drew a slow breath. General, with respect, the warning was not based on confirmed intelligence. The private had no visual confirmation of enemy troops. No patrol had verified armor. Aerial reconnaissance showed no movement. Under those conditions, delaying an operation based on the instinct of a single enlisted man would have set a precedent that would have kept 37 men alive. Patton's voice did not rise. That was the thing about Patton that his officers feared most. He was most dangerous when he was quiet. Whitaker stopped speaking. Patton turned toward the room. Who in this room had access to this warning before the attack? Several hands rose slowly. Not all of them. Some men chose to look at the floor rather than answer honestly, which told Patton everything he needed to know about the culture that had allowed this to happen. Who believed it? No hands. The room stayed still. Who was the only man who was right? The silence stretched until one captain glanced toward the rear wall, then another. Then one by one the eyes of every officer in 3rd Army headquarters turned toward a 22-year-old rifleman from Iowa who was standing very still and looking like he would have preferred to be anywhere else on Earth at that particular moment. Patton nodded once. "Private Mercer, step forward." Mercer obeyed. He stopped 3 paces from the table. He did not know where to look, so he looked at the wall above the general's head. "Tell me what you heard. Exactly. The way you told your colonel." Mercer spoke without notes. He described the silence in the forest, the missing birds, the track marks in the new snow, the width and depth that ruled out farm equipment and light vehicles, the houses with no chimney smoke at an hour when any living family would have had a fire burning for 3 hours already. The engine sounds he had heard the night before, brief intervals of running engines followed by silence. The sound of armored vehicles being repositioned without lights. He spoke plainly without officer language, without technical vocabulary because he did not have any. He described what a man with 22 years of listening to forests describes when the forest tells him something is wrong. When he finished, the room was completely silent. Patton said, "How did you know the engines were being repositioned, rather than simply passing through?" "They kept stopping, sir, and starting again from a slightly different direction each time. Something passing through keeps moving. Something being placed stops and then adjusts." Patton looked at Whitaker. "Did he tell you that—" Whitaker's jaw tightened. "He mentioned engines in the forest, sir. He did not. He told you exactly that." Patton picked up the warning document and read from it directly. "Engine sounds multiple brief intervals repositioning pattern consistent with vehicles being placed under cover." Those are his words, Colonel. Written at 2100 hours. 6 hours and 47 minutes before German armor opened fire from concealed positions in that forest. He set the paper down. "You told him forests do not write intelligence reports." Whitaker said nothing. "You were wrong," Patton said. "This one did, and your men paid the tuition." The room stayed silent. No one laughed. No one shifted their weight. No one looked anywhere except at the 2 men standing on opposite sides of a table that had just become the dividing line between those who could hear the truth and those who had decided their rank made them immune to it. Patton's decision regarding Whitaker was announced the following morning. The colonel was relieved of operational command, effective immediately. That part was expected. What was not expected was the second order. Before his transfer was processed, Whitaker would report to the casualty processing station attached to the unit hid in the forest. There, under the supervision of a chaplain and a medical officer, he would personally assist in writing the notification letters sent to the families of every soldier killed in the failed advance. Not reports. Letters. Not numbers. Names. The first envelope carried the name of a 19-year-old rifleman from Indiana. The second belonged to a machine gunner from Pennsylvania. The third was addressed to the family of a platoon sergeant in Missouri, who had 3 children, and a wife, who had not yet been told that her husband died on frozen ground, because a warning was dismissed at a briefing table 6 hours before the German guns opened fire. One by one, the names crossed Whitaker's desk. Each letter required him to describe the circumstances of a death he had not prevented when prevention had been within his reach. By the end of the first day, witnesses at the station reported that the colonel's hands had begun to shake, not from cold, from the specific and irreversible weight of understanding that the cost of his certainty was not abstract. It sat in front of him as handwriting on paper, as addresses, as children who would grow up without fathers, as women who would spend the rest of their lives marking time from a date in February 1945 when a letter arrived with a government seal on the envelope. Patton understood something about accountability that most commanders never fully grasped. A man can survive being removed from command. He can tell himself it was politics, or bad weather, or impossible circumstances. He can rebuild his narrative around the idea that the disaster was simply one more ugly accident in a war full of ugly accidents. What a man cannot as easily survive is being made to look at the specific human cost of a specific decision he made with specific names attached to specific consequences, written out in his own handwriting, addressed to people he will never meet. That was not cruelty. That was education. And Patton believed that education of that kind had to be paid for at full price, or it would not be retained. Private Daniel Mercer was returned to his unit. He did not receive a promotion. He did not receive a commendation at that time. He was 22 years old, and he went back to the front line because that was where his war was, and because men like Mercer did not expect to be celebrated for being right. They had not been raised to expect that. They had been raised to observe, to report, and to survive. But inside that regiment, the story moved, the way stories always move through military units, quietly mouth to ear from one exhausted soldier to the next. A private had seen it. A colonel had dismissed it. Patton had made the entire command structure look at the result without being permitted to look away. And now in the foxholes and motor pools and mess tents of the Third Army officers were asking each other a question they had not been asking the week before. Who else is seeing something we are not listening to? That question was more valuable than any single piece of aerial reconnaissance. It was more useful than a dozen confirmed intelligence reports, because it was the question that rebuilt at the ground level the thing that Whitaker's confidence had destroyed. The thing that keeps soldiers alive when maps are wrong and reports are late, and the enemy is hiding exactly where someone already tried to warn you. The willingness to listen before the forest starts shooting. But the story does not end with a lesson. Lessons in wartime have a way of being tested immediately. Because somewhere east of that forest, German intelligence officers had intercepted fragments of American radio traffic from the morning of the ambush. They had noted something unusual in the patterns of American response. The ambush had worked, but not as completely as it should have. American units had taken casualties, but had not collapsed. Someone had organized a coherent defense faster than the timeline suggested was possible. They began asking their own questions about why. And the answer they were working towards slowly and methodically was going to create a problem that no single private's warning could solve. In Part 3, we will see what happens when the lessons of February 6th collide with a German command that has started paying attention to the same silence Mercer heard, and has decided to use it differently. The stakes in Part 3 are not 37 men. They are considerably larger. And the clock is already running. Mercer saw it. Patton heard it. Whitaker paid for ignoring it. 37 men died in a forest that one private had already named as dangerous 6 hours before the German guns opened fire. A colonel was stripped of command and made to write letters to grieving families by hand. And inside Third Army headquarters, every officer who had laughed in that briefing tent was now asking a question they had never asked before. Who else is seeing something we are not listening to? That was where Part 2 left us. But here is what nobody in that headquarters anticipated. The lesson Patton forced on his own officer corps was traveling in two directions simultaneously. West toward American units learning to listen differently, and east toward German intelligence officers who had intercepted enough radio traffic from the morning of February 6th to understand that something unusual had happened on the Allied side of that forest. Something that did not match the pattern of a normal ambush response. They were asking their own questions now, and the answers they were assembling would force Mercer Patton and the entire Third Army into a confrontation that made the original ambush look like a rehearsal. German 7th Army intelligence received the fragmented radio intercepts from February 6th within 18 hours of the ambush. The initial analysis was straightforward. American unit hit. Significant casualties. Advance disrupted. Standard outcome for a well-executed concealed armor deployment. But the senior analyst assigned to the report, an Oberst named Friedrich Krenz, who had spent 3 years studying American tactical communication patterns, noticed something that did not fit. The American response time after initial contact was wrong. Not slower than expected. Faster. Units that should have required 40 to 60 minutes to reorganize under surprise fire had begun coherent defensive positioning within 22 minutes. Wounded extraction began within 15. That speed was inconsistent with a unit that had been genuinely surprised. It was consistent with a unit that had been partially warned. Krenz requested the full intercept file. He found the gap. Between 2100 hours on February 5th and 0200 hours on February 6th, American radio traffic in the operational area had contained an anomaly. A brief encrypted burst from a forward position that did not match standard reporting protocols. Someone had transmitted something outside the normal intelligence chain. Someone at ground level had pushed information upward through an irregular channel. The transmission had not reached the right people in time to stop the advance, but it had reached enough people to accelerate the response once the shooting started. And that meant the Americans had a warning system operating below the formal intelligence structure. Informal. Human. Perceptual. The kind of early detection that was extraordinarily difficult to suppress because it did not depend on technology that could be jammed or communications that could be monitored. Krenz briefed his commanding officer on February 9th. The room held 6 senior officers. His conclusion was direct. The Americans have soldiers capable of reading terrain absence as tactical intelligence. If this capability is formalized and distributed across their forward units, our ability to conduct concealed preparations will be severely compromised. We must either identify and eliminate these observers before operations begin, or we must alter our preparation signatures to eliminate the indicators they are trained to detect. The second option was effectively impossible. You cannot make armored vehicles move silently. You cannot prevent birds from responding to large formations moving through forest. You cannot keep civilians in place when a military force needs them removed for operational security. The environmental signatures that Mercer had read were not accidental. They were inherent to the physics of moving a large armed force through occupied terrain. Eliminating them entirely would require not moving at all. That left the first option, and it represented a genuine escalation. German units in the operational area received modified orders beginning February 12th. Forward observers and ground-level scouts operating in advance of American positions were to be treated as priority targets, not because of their firepower, but because of their eyes. The Germans were not trying to stop American artillery or armor. They were trying to silence the men who could hear the forest. In the 2 weeks following February 6th, 4 American scouts operating in forward observation positions in the 3rd Army sector were killed by precision sniper fire under circumstances that did not match standard engagement patterns. They were not caught in firefights. They were shot while stationary at ranges suggesting deliberate targeting rather than opportunistic fire. The deaths were initially logged as isolated incidents. It was Mercer who first identified the pattern during a routine debriefing on February 18th, when he pointed out that all 4 men had been positioned in the kind of locations where someone trained to read terrain silence would naturally place themselves. The Germans were hunting the listeners. That information reached Patton on February 19th. The general read the analysis twice. Then he looked at the officer who delivered it. "Who identified the targeting pattern?" "Private Mercer, sir." Patton set the report down. "Promote him." That order was processed the following morning. Daniel Mercer of Des Moines, Iowa became Corporal Daniel Mercer before he had time to fully understand what had happened. It was not a ceremony. It was a single notation in a personnel file. But inside his unit, every man understood what it meant. The Army had officially acknowledged that a farm boy who listened to forests was more valuable than the rank structure had previously been willing to admit. But the promotion was secondary to the problem it had emerged from. Because while American command was processing the implications of deliberate observer targeting German forces in the Prüm River corridor, were completing preparations for a counterthrust that had been planned for 2 weeks. February 20th, 1945. The Prüm Corridor, Western Germany, 0520 hours. The German force was not large by the standards of the Ardennes offensive. 1 reinforced regiment, approximately 2,200 men, supported by 19 tanks and a mobile artillery battery. Their objective was a road junction 3 kilometers west of the town of Prüm that, if taken and held for 48 hours, would disrupt American supply lines to 2 forward divisions and force a reallocation of resources from the primary advance. The preparation had been meticulous. Radio silence observed for 72 hours prior. Vehicle movement conducted exclusively at night. Civilian population in the staging area evacuated under cover of a stated minesweeping operation. The Germans had in effect applied every lesson from the February 6th ambush. They had eliminated the obvious signatures. They had moved in darkness. They had controlled the local population. What they had not eliminated was the cold. The staging area for the German armor was a pine forest on the eastern slope of a ridge above the Prüm Valley. In February, that forest normally held a population of approximately 400 red deer, using the protected terrain as winter cover. Wildlife surveys conducted by American forward units in the weeks prior, part of a new terrain assessment protocol implemented directly in response to Mercer's observations, had established baseline wildlife activity patterns for every major forest in the operational area. On February 19th, an American scout named Private First Class Thomas Aldrich reported that the deer population in the eastern Prüm forest had vanished, not reduced, gone. The full population absent from a location where they had been reliably present for 6 consecutive weeks. Aldrich filed his observation at 1940 hours on February 19th. It reached the newly restructured Forward Intelligence Channel, which had been designed specifically to elevate ground-level perceptual reports following the February 6th disaster at 2015 hours. By 2100 hours, the report was on a divisional intelligence desk. By 2230 hours, it had been cross-referenced with 2 additional observations, an absence of owl activity in the same forest, and fresh compression marks on a logging road that had shown no traffic in the previous 2 weeks. By midnight, a reconnaissance in force had been ordered. Artillery preparation began at 0447 hours on February 20th, 13 minutes before the German advance was scheduled to launch. Shells land. Trees burn. The pine forest on the eastern ridge becomes fire in 60 seconds. German armor that has spent 72 hours positioning under radio silence is suddenly receiving direct artillery fire on coordinates that should have been unknown to the Americans. Tank commanders open hatches. They see American artillery registration patterns that are impossibly accurate for blind fire. They are not blind. They know where you are. German infantry begin moving earlier than planned, trying to escape the artillery. This destroys the coordination of the assault before it begins. Units that were supposed to advance in sequence are now moving in fragments, responding to fire rather than executing a plan. The mobile artillery battery attempts to reposition. American counter-battery fire finds it within 4 minutes. 2 of the 3 guns are destroyed before they complete their first movement. The German tank commander, a major named Heinrich Voss, makes a decision that will define the next 6 hours. He orders his remaining 17 operable tanks to push forward on the road rather than wait for infantry coordination. He believes speed can still salvage the objective. He is wrong. The road approaches to the Prüm junction have been pre-registered by American artillery exactly because the terrain analysis conducted using Mercer's observational framework identified them as the only viable approach routes for armor of that weight class. The tanks are moving into a prepared fire lane. The first tank hits a mine at 0519 hours. The explosion blocks the road. The second and third tanks attempt to go around and become stuck in ground that the overnight freeze had made deceptively firm on the surface but unstable beneath the weight of 40 tons. American anti-tank fire opens from 3 directions. Controlled, methodical, not reactive, pre-planned. In 41 minutes, the German counterthrust loses 11 tanks, approximately 340 infantry casualties, and the complete destruction of the mobile artillery battery. Major Voss orders withdrawal at 0603 hours. American units pursue as far as the ridgeline. The road junction at Prüm remains in Allied hands. The action is recorded in the official record as the Battle of the Prüm Corridor, February 20th, 1945. It is not one of the famous engagements of the European theater. It does not appear in most histories of the Third Army. But inside the intelligence community of the American military, it is documented as the first operation in the Western European theater where a formalized ground-level perceptual reporting system directly prevented a prepared enemy offensive from achieving its objective. Compared to February 6th, American casualties were reduced by 83% in an engagement of comparable scale. German losses were 4 times higher than their own projections had anticipated. The after-action report used careful military language to describe what had happened. But what had actually happened was simpler. Deer had moved. A private had noticed. The system built to listen to privates had worked. And 19 German tanks were burning on a frozen ridge above a river valley because someone had understood that silence is data and absence is a warning. And the forest always tells the truth to anyone willing to hear it. The impact moved outward from Prüm in concentric circles. By the end of February 11, American divisions in the European theater had implemented some version of the Forward Perceptual Reporting Protocol. The protocol had no official name yet. Soldiers in the field called it listening posts, which was an existing term repurposed for a new function. But what they were doing was different from traditional listening post operations. They were not simply monitoring for sounds. They were monitoring for the absence of expected sounds, the presence of unexpected silence, the behavioral disruption of wildlife and civilian populations that preceded large military movements. German after-action analysis from March 1945, captured following the Rhine crossing, showed that Wehrmacht planners had identified the new American capability and classified it as a significant operational constraint. 2 planned operations in the Western German theater were cancelled between February 20th and March 10th, 1945 specifically, because pre-operational terrain surveys indicated that the staging areas contained wildlife and civilian population signatures that American forward observers were now trained to detect. Operations that were never launched do not appear in casualty statistics. But they represent lives not lost on both sides, because a warning system learned to listen to what was missing. Daniel Mercer received his second promotion in March 1945. He did not request it. He was recommended by his company commander, countersigned by his battalion commander, and approved through a divisional headquarters that had 6 weeks earlier been a place where his name had no significance whatsoever. He became Sergeant Daniel Mercer 3 days before his 23rd birthday. He was standing in a field in Germany when he heard it. A crow somewhere to the northeast, calling once, then going silent. He stopped walking and stood for a long moment, listening to the shape of the quiet that followed. Then he turned to the scout walking beside him and said it was time to find a different route. They found a different route. Nobody shot at them that afternoon. But here is the part of this story that most histories skip entirely. What happened to Daniel Mercer when the war ended? What happened to the system he had demonstrated was possible? What happened to the lesson that Patton had burned into an entire officer corps with the specific and deliberate application of accountability? In Part 4, we will follow Mercer home to Iowa and discover that the most important chapter of this story did not happen in a European forest. It happened 30 years later in a room where a young officer was reading a manual that contained, buried on page 47, a methodology for ground-level perceptual intelligence reporting that had no named author. A methodology that had saved hundreds of lives and shaped the final months of the Second World War. A methodology that had been quietly filed away under a classification that was only lifted in 1971. The story of how Private Daniel Mercer became a doctrine rather than a legend is one of the most quietly extraordinary things to emerge from the entire European theater. And almost nobody knows it happened. A farm boy from Iowa read A Silent Forest. A colonel laughed at him. 37 men died. Patton read a warning filed 6 hours before the guns opened fire and made an entire officer corps look at what arrogance had cost without being permitted to look away. In Part 3, we watched German intelligence hunt. The listeners watched deer vanish from a pine forest above the Prüm Valley and watched a new kind of warning system turn a prepared German counterthrust into burning tanks on a frozen ridge. 11 divisions adopted the protocol. 2 German operations were cancelled before they began because the staging areas had the wrong kind of silence. But here is the question that Part 3 left open. What happened to Daniel Mercer when the shooting stopped? What happened to the system he demonstrated was possible? And what is the detail buried in a declassified file from 1971 that almost nobody has found, that changes the way this entire story should be understood, because success in wartime does not always look the way you expect it to? The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. VE Day arrived in bursts of celebration across the continent, in cities that had been rubble 6 months earlier, in fields that had been killing grounds 6 weeks before. For most American soldiers, the news arrived through radio broadcasts and the sudden, almost incomprehensible absence of incoming fire. For Daniel Mercer, it arrived while he was standing at the edge of a forest in central Germany, doing what he had always done: listening. He was 23 years old. He had been promoted twice in 4 months. He had a sergeant's stripes he had not requested, and a reputation inside his regiment that he had never sought. He was also exhausted in the specific way that combat soldiers become exhausted, not from lack of sleep, though there had been very little of that either, but from the sustained expenditure of full-capacity attention across months of days where the cost of distraction was measured in lives. He was ready to go home. The Army processed him out in September 1945. His discharge paperwork listed his rank as sergeant, his occupation as rifleman, and his service record as satisfactory. There was no commendation attached, no citation for the warning of February 5th. No formal recognition of the perceptual reporting methodology that had contributed to the Prüm corridor outcome and been adopted across 11 divisions. The paperwork was thorough and completely silent on every significant thing he had actually done. He returned to the farm outside Des Moines. His father was older. The fields needed work. The corn had not planted itself during the years he was gone, and neither had any of the other tasks that accumulate on a small farm when the men who run it are fighting in Europe. Mercer spent the autumn of 1945 repairing fences and clearing drainage ditches and walking the perimeter of his family's timber in the early mornings, relearning the sounds of a forest that was not trying to kill anyone. He did not talk much about the war. This was not unusual among men who came home from it. What was slightly unusual was the specific thing he did not talk about. Not the combat, not the casualties, not the cold or the fear or the particular ugliness of the forest on February 6th at dawn. What he did not talk about was the warning, the briefing tent, the colonel who had laughed, the report that had reached Patton's desk. He had filed it, delivered it, and watched it be dismissed. He had been right. Men had died. He had been promoted and had then gone back to the front line, because that was where his war was. And then the war had ended and he had come home to Iowa, and that was the complete arc of his experience as far as the public record was concerned. The neighbors knew he had served. They knew he had come back. They did not know anything else, and Mercer did not correct that. He was a farmer. He was good at farming. He understood land and seasons and the way timber changed through a year. He was 23 years old, and he intended to spend the rest of his life in Des Moines County, and that was enough. But the lesson he had demonstrated did not come home with him. It kept moving. The perceptual reporting protocol that had emerged from February 6, 1945, was formalized into American military doctrine in stages across the late 1940s and early 1950s. The process was slow, bureaucratic, and largely invisible to anyone outside the intelligence community. It did not carry Mercer's name. It did not carry anyone's name. Military doctrine rarely works that way. Ideas enter the institutional body through after-action reports and field assessments and internal memoranda. They are refined by committees and tested by war colleges and eventually codified into manuals that list methods without authors, principles without origins, procedures without the human decisions that first demonstrated they were possible. By 1950, a methodology for ground-level environmental intelligence, specifically the systematic monitoring of wildlife behavior, civilian population movement, and acoustic pattern disruption, as indicators of large enemy force concentration, had been incorporated into the Forward Observer training curriculum at the infantry school at Fort Benning, Georgia. The methodology occupied 4 pages in a supplementary manual. It had no title beyond its section number. Page 47. When American forces deployed to Korea in June 1950, They carried that manual. Units operating in the heavily forested terrain of the Korean Peninsula found the environmental monitoring methodology directly applicable to a landscape where conventional aerial reconnaissance was frequently blocked by weather, and where enemy forces routinely used mountainous forest terrain to conceal troop movements. Documented instances of successful early warning based on wildlife behavioral disruption appear in at least 7 Korean War after-action reports between 1950 and 1953. The reports cite the methodology by its manual reference. None of them cite its origin. In Vietnam, the methodology evolved further. The dense jungle environment of Southeast Asia created conditions where environmental monitoring became even more critical than it had been in European theater operations. American advisors working with South Vietnamese forces in the early 1960s refined the protocol to account for tropical wildlife behavior patterns that differed significantly from European or Korean equivalents. A bird that falls silent in a German pine forest is reading the same fundamental signal as a bird that falls silent in a Vietnamese jungle, but the species are different, the baseline patterns are different, and the interpretation requires locally specific knowledge. American forces in Vietnam invested substantially in developing that local knowledge, drawing on indigenous scouts whose relationship to their specific landscape mirrored in ways the military never formally acknowledged, the relationship that Daniel Mercer had developed with the timber outside Des Moines. By the 1980s, the core principle had been absorbed into Special Forces doctrine under the broader framework of environmental situational awareness. It had influenced the development of sensor systems designed to detect the disruption of natural sound environments, the forerunner of acoustic monitoring technologies that are now standard in military forward operating base perimeter security. The physics that Mercer had understood instinctively in 1945, that a large armed force moving through natural terrain produces a detectable disruption in the behavior of everything else. Living in that terrain had become the theoretical basis for an entire class of detection technology. The specific dollar value invested in acoustic and environmental sensor development by the American military between 1970 and 2000 exceeds $4 billion. The intellectual lineage of that investment runs through a chain of doctrine and methodology and institutional memory, back to a private who noticed that the birds had stopped calling on the night of February 5, 1945. That is the technology inheritance. But Patton's lesson, the human one, is the inheritance that matters more and travels further. Because what February 6th demonstrated was not simply that environmental monitoring works. It demonstrated something about the relationship between institutional rank and operational truth that applies to every organization that has ever failed by listening to the wrong people. The British Army has a documented phrase used in leadership training since the 1970s that translates roughly as, "The man closest to the ground knows what the ground is doing." It appears in at least 3 NATO military doctrine documents produced between 1975 and 1995. The concept is not revolutionary. Every experienced soldier has understood it at some level throughout the history of organized warfare. What February 6th added was not the concept, but the proof of what happens when institutions systematically fail to operationalize it. When the gap between knowing and doing becomes a gap measured in lives. The same failure pattern appears outside military contexts with striking regularity. In 1986, engineers at Morton Thiokol attempted to delay the launch of the Space Shuttle Challenger based on concerns about O-ring performance in cold temperatures. They were overruled by managers who trusted schedule and institutional pressure over the ground-level technical observation of the people closest to the hardware. 7 astronauts died. The Rogers Commission report, produced afterward, identified the decision-making structure as the fundamental failure. Engineers had the warning. The institution had not built a system that allowed warnings from the right level to reach the right ears in time to matter. In 2008, a significant number of quantitative analysts at financial institutions had identified warning indicators in the mortgage securities market that their institutional superiors were structurally motivated to dismiss. The pattern of dismissal was not identical to Colonel Whitaker's, but the architecture was the same. rank confidence and institutional momentum overriding ground-level observation. The cost measured in human economic damage across the following 3 years was incalculable. Patton understood that the lesson had to be paid for at full price, or it would not be retained. That is why he did not simply remove Whitaker. That is why he made him write the letters. Because the letters forced the gap closed between the decision and its consequences, between the confidence in the briefing tent and the handwriting on the envelopes, between the rank that had made dismissal feel safe and the names of the people who had paid for that safety with their lives. And that is the methodology that no manual has ever fully captured. You cannot institutionalize conscience, but you can refuse to let the institution protect itself from consequence. Now here is the detail from the declassified file. In 1971, the Army Intelligence Center at Fort Huachuca, Arizona, completed a historical review of World War II intelligence methodology innovations as part of a broader curriculum development project. The review was classified at the time of completion. It was partially declassified in 1989 and fully released in 2003 under a Freedom of Information Act request filed by a military historian at the University of Kansas. Inside that review, in a section documenting the development of ground-level environmental intelligence protocols, the authors had traced the methodology back through the documentary chain to its operational origin. They had found the after-action reports from February 1945. They had found the Prüm corridor documentation. They had found the personnel file that showed 2 promotions in 4 months for a rifleman who had no prior intelligence training. And they had found something else that had never been included in any public account of the events. A letter, written by George S. Patton in March 1945, addressed to the commanding officer of Mercer's regiment. The letter was brief. Patton's letters usually were. It recommended that Sergeant Daniel Mercer be formally recognized for the development and demonstration of a ground-level observational intelligence methodology that had, in the general's assessment, prevented at least one significant operational failure and contributed materially to the success of subsequent actions in the Third Army sector. The letter recommended a specific decoration. It named the citation language that should accompany it. The decoration was never awarded. Patton died in December 1945 from injuries sustained in a traffic accident near Mannheim, Germany. The letter had been filed in the regimental records rather than forwarded up the administrative chain, and in the reorganization of records following the end of the war, it had been catalogued under a reference number that did not cross-index with Mercer's personnel file. It sat in an archive for 26 years, recommending recognition for a man who had gone home to Iowa and planted corn. The 1971 review found it. The researchers noted it in their documentation. They included a line in the final report observing that the subject had returned to civilian life and that no subsequent contact or recognition had been made. They noted this without editorial comment because military historical reviews do not typically include editorial comment. But the fact of it sits in the public record now for anyone who looks. Patton had tried. The institution had filed the letter in the wrong place and moved on. Daniel Mercer died in 1987 in Des Moines, Iowa. He was 65 years old. His obituary in the local paper noted his military service in the European theater and his decades of farming in Des Moines County. It did not mention February 5, 1945. It did not mention the warning. It did not mention the 37 men, or the Prüm corridor, or the 11 divisions, or the $4 billion in sensor technology that had grown from a principle he had demonstrated in a pine forest at night while listening for engines he could barely hear. He was survived by his wife, 2 sons and a daughter, who said in the years after his death that he had rarely spoken about the war, but that every morning until the end of his life, he had walked the timber on the property before sunrise. Listening. Just listening, from a farm boy with no rank and no credentials, standing at the edge of a dark forest, with nothing but the knowledge of what a healthy forest sounds like to a doctrine carried into Korea and Vietnam, and every forest where American soldiers have since tried to hear what the terrain is trying to tell them. Daniel Mercer did not change the war by firing a weapon. He changed it by paying attention when everyone above him had already decided that attention was unnecessary. And the truth he demonstrated in February 1945 is the same truth that has ended careers and saved lives and broken institutions and rebuilt them in every field of human endeavor since the truth that rank does not make you right. That silence is data, that the person closest to the ground knows what the ground is doing, and that the most dangerous thing any organization can do is build a structure that makes it safe to ignore the people who are actually listening. History is full of warnings that arrived in time and were dismissed by men who believed their experience outranked someone else's eyes. The only question that has ever mattered is the one Patton left hanging in that room in February 1945, when he placed a private's warning on top of a colonel's casualty list and asked the room to look at what the ordering meant. Will anyone listen before it is too late?